Most enterprises tell themselves a comfortable story. We moved to Azure, therefore we're modern. That story keeps people calm, right up until the first budget review, the first audit, or the first outage post-mortem. Because cloud strategy isn't a technology decision. It's a decision about how the business wants to operate. And across dozens of large enterprises, different industries, same patterns keep repeating. If cloud strategy were working, why do the same failures keep repeating? Here's the open loop. Governance can increase speed when it removes ambiguity instead of adding paperwork. The enterprise cloud problem, intent versus configuration. The foundational misunderstanding is simple. Intent is what people say in meetings. Configuration is what the platform executes at scale. And the platform doesn't care about your intent. Azure doesn't hear the town hall. Entra doesn't remember the steering committee's slides. Microsoft 365 doesn't respect the "we trust our people" speech. The control plane reads one thing, configuration. That distinction matters because executives approve strategies as intent statements. Architects and engineers implement them as configurations. And every gap between those two becomes a liability that grows over time. Organizations don't usually fail at cloud because they picked the wrong service. They fail because they treat strategy like a document, then treat configuration like a local team preference. Those two approaches are incompatible. A distributed platform amplifies whatever you encode. Okay, so basically, cloud strategy is the discipline of turning verbal goals into enforceable constraints. When that discipline is missing, you get strategy decay. And it happens in a predictable way. It starts with exceptions. Not misconfigurations. Those are too easy to blame on individuals. Exceptions are design omissions that become entropy generators. Just this once, give this team owner. Just this once, allow public access. Just this once, skip the policy assignment because the release is Friday. Each exception feels small. Each exception feels temporary. None of them are, because the platform doesn't understand temporary. It understands current state. Over time, these exceptions convert what should be a deterministic security model into a probabilistic one. Deterministic means the system behaves the same way every time for the same conditions. Probabilistic means you've created a world where outcomes depend on which pathway someone finds, which legacy permission still exists, and which policy was waived 6 months ago. And that's when executives experience what I'll call cloud disappointment. They were promised speed, but delivery is still slow. They were promised control, but audits still hurt. They were promised cost efficiency, but the bill looks like a ransom note. And the weird part is that everyone can point at being in Azure as proof progress happened. Workloads moved, subscriptions exist, dashboards exist, but behaviors didn't change. Decision rights didn't change. Accountability didn't change. So what this actually means is the organization brought an on-prem operating model into a cloud control plane and expected the control plane to fix the organization. It won't. In architectural terms, if intent isn't enforced, politics becomes the control plane. That's not a metaphor, that's the literal mechanism. When guardrails are optional, every boundary becomes negotiable. When every boundary is negotiable, the person with the most leverage gets the exception. And once exceptions exist, everyone else demands parity. Entropy spreads through fairness. Nobody stands up in a steering committee and says, "We are intentionally building a system that requires humans to remember the rules." But that's what happens when governance is defined as documentation, not enforcement. And this is where people often get the stakes wrong. They think enforcement is about slowing teams down. Enforcement is about removing ambiguity so teams can move without asking permission. If your strategy depends on people behaving correctly, you don't have a strategy, you have a hope. The system will eventually express the truth of your design. If roles are overbroad, you will get overreach. If network boundaries are vague, you will get lateral movement. If cost ownership is unclear, you will get waste. If identity governance is optional, you will get privilege drift. These pathways accumulate. Now, a quick clarification before someone tries to turn this into a philosophy debate. This isn't a call for central control and endless approvals. That's just another form of failure. What this is saying is that cloud strategy is the explicit choice of trade-offs encoded into the platform, so execution doesn't require negotiation every time. That's the move from slogans to definitions. And it's why the rest of this episode keeps coming back to the same uncomfortable theme. Azure is an execution environment for enterprise constraints. If you refuse to define those constraints, Azure doesn't give you freedom. It gives you conditional chaos. So from here, the next step is to force definitions that most organizations keep blurry on purpose: adoption, migration, and strategy. Because when you mix those words, you can claim success without changing anything. Strategy versus adoption versus migration, forcing real definitions. Most organizations blur these words because blur is politically useful. If you can call a training program strategy, you can declare victory without changing decision rights. If you can call a lift and shift transformation, you can shut down uncomfortable questions about operating models. So the episode is going to force clean definitions, not because definitions are academic, because definitions create consequences. Here's the triad: say it once now and then you'll hear it again later, because it's the only way executives remember anything in a crisis. Adoption is exposure, migration is movement, strategy is choice. Adoption is exposure. It's the organization touching the platform and learning where the edges are. It looks like people getting access, teams learning how subscriptions work, security learning what conditional means, finance learning that invoices can change daily, and engineers learning that they can provision in minutes and break things in seconds. Adoption proves capability. It does not prove outcomes. Adoption can be a handful of workloads, a pilot landing zone, a training program, or a cloud center of excellence that starts forming opinions. That's fine. Exposure matters. But adoption has a common failure mode. It creates optimism without enforcement. Everyone feels progress because something is happening. Dashboards exist, accounts exist, there's a new backlog, but the business hasn't made any binding choices yet, so execution still negotiates everything in real time. Migration is movement. It's the act of relocating workloads and dependencies from one execution environment to another. Sometimes that's a rehost, sometimes it's replatforming, sometimes it's a rebuild. But the core property of migration is simple. Stuff moved. Migration is necessary in many environments. It might even be urgent if hardware is aging, licenses are expiring, or the data center exit clock is ticking. But migration has its own failure mode. It's measurable, so it becomes the target. Workloads moved equals progress, except what you moved might be an on-prem architecture with on-prem assumptions and on-prem controls, now running on a variable cost platform with a distributed authorization engine. That's how you end up with cloud as expensive hosting, which we'll get to later. Strategy is choice. Strategy is where executives stop being inspirational and start being accountable. It's the explicit trade-off decisions that decide how the organization operates in cloud when nobody's watching. Strategy is constraints. It's deciding in advance what kinds of risk are acceptable, where autonomy exists, where it doesn't, and how exceptions get handled when they inevitably appear. And here's the part most people miss. Strategy is not the choice of Azure. Choosing Azure is procurement. Strategy is translating business goals into enforceable intent inside Azure. A real cloud strategy produces artifacts that constrain behavior, not because the platform is untrustworthy, but because humans are inconsistent and incentives drift. If you don't encode your choices, you will redecide them forever. So what does strategy as choice look like in practice? It sounds like uncomfortable sentences. We will trade some developer freedom for default security because we can't staff incidents forever. We will trade some central control for team throughput, but only inside guardrails we can audit. We will fund redundancy even when nothing is broken because resilience isn't a purchase order you rush after an outage. Those are not technical decisions. Those are operating model decisions. Azure just enforces them. And this is where cloud principles matter if you use them correctly. Most organizations treat principles like posters, statements that everyone agrees with and nobody uses. Security first. Automate everything. Cloud first. Great. Completely useless in conflict. Principles only matter when they resolve conflict. When product teams want speed and security wants assurance, a principle should break the tie. When finance wants predictability and engineering wants flexibility, a principle should define who gets what and what the cost is. In other words, principles aren't values. They're conflict resolution tools. So if you're listening as a CIO, here's the practical test. If your cloud strategy can't answer who decides, what's enforced, and what happens when teams disagree, you don't have strategy. You have adoption activity and migration plans. And remember the triad because it cuts through the noise every time. Adoption is exposure, migration is movement, strategy is choice. Now that the definitions are clean, the Azure decision becomes legible because we can talk about why enterprises end up there without pretending the platform itself is the strategy. Why enterprises choose Azure, ecosystem gravity without the marketing. Most enterprises don't select Azure the way marketing slides pretend they do. They arrive there, not because Azure is magical and not because other clouds can't do the job, but because Microsoft already owns a lot of the enterprise gravity wells: identity, endpoints, collaboration, licensing, procurement, and audit narratives. That gravity isn't a technical preference, it's organizational physics. If a company already runs Microsoft 365, it already runs an identity system that mediates access to email, documents, Teams meetings, SharePoint, and a mountain of third-party SaaS apps. It already lives inside Entra. So when that same company starts building cloud workloads, the path of least resistance is obvious. Use the identity system you already depend on to authorize the people and automation that will operate those workloads. And yes, other clouds integrate, they all do, but Azure integration isn't an add-on. It's the native continuation of an ecosystem most enterprises already can't unwind. That distinction matters. Endpoints are another example of hidden gravity. If device posture, compliance, and authentication already flow through Microsoft's tooling stack, then the organization already thinks in Microsoft control plane terms, even if they don't say it out loud. So when security teams ask, how do we enforce access conditions at scale? They tend to reach for the levers they already know how to defend in an audit. Azure fits that political requirement better than a new control surface everyone has to learn under pressure. Licensing and procurement are the unglamorous accelerants. Azure consumption can write the same enterprise agreements, approval pathways, vendor onboarding, and legal templates that already exist. That reduces friction. Not because it's strategically enlightened, but because it's administratively survivable. Executives don't call it ecosystem gravity now, they call it, we can actually get this approved. Now, here's the part people miss. This isn't unique to Azure. Every hyperscaler has gravitational pull in the organizations that grew up with it. AWS has it in startups that became enterprises. Google has it in data-first shops and certain research-heavy industries. Azure just exposes the enterprise constraints faster because Microsoft already sits in the daily operating fabric of the business. So in reality, enterprises choose Azure as an execution environment for the constraints they already have: compliance expectations, enterprise contracting, identity governance, and hybrid operations that are not going away. Hybrid is the default operating condition, not a transitional phase. Most organizations have legacy systems, manufacturing networks, M&A leftovers, sovereignty requirements, or latency-sensitive workloads that won't move cleanly. Even when they want to, dependencies and risk posture usually say otherwise. So cloud first becomes cloud and. Azure tends to fit that story because Microsoft has invested heavily in hybrid management patterns and because the enterprise wants one set of governance narratives across environments, even when the reality is messy. But don't confuse that with strategy. Choosing Azure doesn't answer the questions that actually determine success. Who owns the guardrails? Who has autonomy? What gets standardized? And what gets treated as an exception? Azure will happily host whatever you ask for. It will also happily host your dysfunction. This is the uncomfortable truth. Azure selection is often an organizational decision disguised as a technical one. And that can be fine. It's rational, but it only works when the enterprise admits what it's optimizing for. If the organization wants maximum integration with the Microsoft estate, then say that out loud. If the organization wants the shortest path to govern scale, then admit that you're paying for operational coherence, not just compute. That's why the best framing here isn't Azure versus everyone else. It's aligned or it's not. If the business already runs on Microsoft identity and collaboration, Azure is aligned. If the organization is committed to hybrid as a permanent design constraint, Azure is aligned. If governance needs to be enforced through a control plane the business can defend to auditors, Azure is aligned. If those statements aren't true, then choosing Azure because everyone else is doing it is just importing someone else's architecture decisions into your risk profile. So now the Azure decision becomes legible. It's not a trophy, it's a consequence. And once you see it that way, the next move is obvious. Choosing Azure isn't strategy. Translating board goals into platform intent is. Business outcomes into platform intent. Translating board language. Boards don't talk in subscriptions, policies, or identity governance. They talk in outcomes: resilience, growth, innovation, risk, and cost predictability. And then they hand those nouns to IT and expect a cloud program to deliver them. That translation step is where strategies either become real or die quietly. Because outcomes are not instructions. Outcomes are constraints you choose to live with, and Azure can only enforce what you bother to translate. Start with the discipline. Write the outcome as a plain sentence that has a cost. If it doesn't have a cost, it's not an outcome, it's branding. Resilience means we fund redundancy even when nothing is broken. Innovation means we accept a controlled blast radius, not uncontrolled risk. Cost efficiency means someone owns the bill and can explain it. Those three sentences sound obvious. They're not. They are the sentences most organizations refuse to say out loud because each one implies a trade-off someone will hate. This is the uncomfortable truth. Board language is polite. Platform intent is not. Platform intent is where the trade-offs show up as enforcement. So how does that translation work? Why? Because if you don't do it, your teams will improvise. They'll improvise availability models. They'll improvise security boundaries. They'll improvise cost controls. And they will improvise in the direction of local incentives, not enterprise outcomes. What? Outcome mapping is the process of converting each board outcome into three things: decision rights, funding rules, and architecture boundaries. Decision rights answer who can decide and who can override. Funding rules answer who pays for resilience and who gets to opt out. Architecture boundaries answer what's mandatory, what's optional, and what's forbidden. How? You take a single outcome and force it through those lenses until it becomes enforceable. Take resilience. If resilience is real, then the enterprise makes a choice. Redundancy is not an optional improvement, it's a default cost of production. That implies funding. You don't ask teams to justify high availability every quarter like it's a luxury item. You budget it as baseline. It implies decision rights. Platform teams define the minimum resilience patterns, and product teams choose higher levels when needed, but they can't choose none without an explicit exception. And it implies boundaries. Certain classes of workloads must use zone-redundant patterns, backups, and tested recovery workflows. Not because Microsoft recommends it, because the board asked for resilience. Now, innovation. Everyone wants innovation. What they usually mean is speed without accountability. That's how you end up with uncontrolled risk. If innovation is a real outcome, then you design for controlled blast radius. You don't let every team invent networking, identity logging, and data access from scratch. You give them fast paths that are pre-approved, and you make the unsafe path slower on purpose. That's a constraint. It's also how you keep innovators from becoming incident generators. And cost predictability. This is where cloud makes executives honest. Cost predictability isn't a dashboard. It's ownership. It's the ability to answer, in plain English, who created this spend, why does it exist, and what happens if it grows 20%. If nobody can answer those questions, then cost optimization becomes theater, a quarterly cleanup project that never touches incentives. Azure will happily provide cost reports. It will not provide accountability. So the translation here is brutal and simple. You map spend to the unit that benefits from it, and you make that unit explain it. Showback is usually the first step. Chargeback might come later. But either way, central IT absorbs everything is not a strategy. It's a subsidy, and subsidies create waste by design. Now, a quick warning for the metrics crowd. Value metrics are not cloud dashboards. Cloud dashboards are infrastructure telemetry. Executives don't run businesses on CPU graphs. Value metrics are business-facing signals that indicate whether the operating model is changing. Lead time to change, time to restore, deployment frequency where it matters, resilience test pass rates, percentage of workloads with clear cost owners, percentage of privileged access with time-bound workflows, number of exceptions, and how long they live. Those are not IT metrics. Those are organizational behavior metrics. And yes, you can map them to Azure and Entra controls, but you don't start with controls. You start with outcomes, then force the controls to serve them. So here's the architectural takeaway. Azure strategy is not a list of services. It's the translation of board outcomes into enforceable platform intent. Who decides, who pays, what's allowed, what's mandatory, and what happens when someone wants an exception. And if you skip that translation, you don't get a neutral outcome. You get drift. And drift always ends the same way. Somebody panics, somebody centralizes, and governance arrives as emergency control, late, harsher, and political. The execution cliff, why nothing changed after migration keeps happening. This is where the cloud program hits the wall. Not because Azure can't deliver, not because the architects don't understand the reference diagrams, but because the organization migrates workloads and keeps the operating reality on-prem. Same approvals, same gates, same submit a ticket and wait reflex, same weekly change window where everything gets bundled into a risky release because that's how it's always been done. The platform changed, the behavior didn't. And when behavior doesn't change, cloud becomes a more expensive way to do the same work with new failure modes you didn't have before. Variable billing, identity sprawl, policy drift, and a control plane that makes every exception persistent. Here's the pattern most enterprises don't want to admit. They treat migration as the finish line, then wonder why the business outcomes don't show up. What they actually built is a hosted version of their old environment with the same organizational friction baked in plus a new invoice. This is the execution cliff, the point where the enterprise realizes it moved the infrastructure faster than it moved decision-making. And the reason nothing changed after migration keeps happening is that the organization kept the same control mechanisms it used to manage scarcity. On-prem lived in a world of scarcity, limited compute, limited storage, limited capacity, long lead times, and a procurement cycle that forced planning. So organizations built governance as a rationing system. Approvals exist because capacity used to be expensive and slow to expand. Cloud flips that. Capacity becomes abundant, but decisions become the bottleneck because now the limiting factor isn't hardware. It's who is allowed to act under what conditions with what accountability. So the on-prem operating model survives in cloud for 3 reasons. First, fear. If people don't trust the new platform, they keep the old approvals as emotional insurance. They don't say that out loud. They say risk management and controls. But the behavior is fear-driven. Slow everything down so nobody gets blamed for moving fast. Second, audit narratives. A lot of organizations believe auditors want paperwork. They are wrong. Auditors want control evidence. But when an enterprise has spent years equating control with a process, it will keep the process even when the platform can enforce the control more reliably. So they keep the approvals, they keep the sign-offs, they keep the screenshots. They create compliance theater because it feels familiar and because nobody wants to be the person who deletes the control that used to protect them. Third, the scarcity mindset. On-prem taught leaders that every environment is precious. Every server is an asset. Every change is a risk. Cloud makes environments disposable, but organizations don't become disposable-minded overnight. They keep treating every workload like a fragile snowflake, which is exactly how you end up with handcrafted exceptions and one-off special cases everywhere. And that leads to what matters operationally: friction debt. Friction debt is the accumulated cost of delayed decisions. Every time a team waits 3 days for an approval, the system isn't just slower that week, it becomes slower forever. Because teams plan around that delay. They batch changes, they avoid small improvements, they stop experimenting, they stop refactoring, they stop cleaning up cost and security issues because it's not worth the process. The enterprise thinks it is managing risk. It is manufacturing latency. And cloud does not tolerate manufactured latency because the cost model punishes indecision. You pay for idle, you pay for over-provisioning. You pay for the environments you can't decommission because nobody owns the decision. You pay for the incidents created by brittle, delayed changes. So here's the reflective moment that matters, especially for executives. If nothing changed after migration, pause. That wasn't a technology failure. That was an organizational design failure. The system did exactly what the organization asked it to do, run workloads inside the same human control structure as before. Azure didn't sabotage the transformation. The transformation never existed in the operating model. And this is where leadership has to accept a constraint that feels uncomfortable. Execution is not a project phase. Execution is a permanent operating condition. If the enterprise wants cloud outcomes, speed, resilience, cost predictability, then it has to redesign who can decide, how decisions get enforced, and how exceptions get treated. Otherwise, the cloud program will keep producing the same outcome: speed promised, bureaucracy delivered. And that leads directly to the first failure pattern that shows up in almost every large enterprise. The mandate is be agile. The implementation is move to Azure. The reality is nothing changed. So let's talk about what that looks like when it happens in the real world. Story 1. The lift and shift trap, cloud as expensive hosting. This pattern shows up everywhere because it feels responsible. The vision sounds clean. We need speed and agility. The business can't wait 6 months for environments, so move to Azure. So the program starts the way most programs start: infrastructure first. Subscriptions get created, networks get connected, a landing zone shows up. Teams migrate a few workloads, usually the ones with the least political resistance. The migration dashboard looks good. Someone says we're progressing. And then the enterprise discovers the trap. Provisioning got faster. Delivery did not. A developer can get a VM in minutes now, sure. A team can spin up a PaaS service quickly, but the actual path to production still runs through the same approval chain. Architecture review board, security sign-off, change advisory board, release window, ticket queue, and an outage avoidance culture that treats every change like a dangerous event. So you get the most frustrating outcome. Azure accelerates the easy parts, while the operating model slows the parts that matter. Everything clicked when I realized what's really happening here. Lift and shift isn't the technical mistake. Lift and shift is often a rational first move. The operating model is the mistake, because the enterprise takes a workload that used to live inside scarcity and it moves it into a platform built for throughput. But it keeps managing it like scarcity, rationed access, centralized gatekeeping, and human approvals as the primary control mechanism. That mismatch produces an ugly split-brain system. Teams can deploy resources quickly in dev, but they can't ship changes safely in prod. Security teams feel like the cloud is out of control, therefore they add more review steps. Finance sees spend increase, therefore they demand more approvals. Operations sees new failure modes, therefore they tighten change windows. The organization responds to the cloud's speed by adding friction, because friction is the only control lever it knows, and the cost curve starts to climb. Not because Azure is inherently expensive, but because the enterprise is now paying for idle capacity created by bureaucracy. Environments sit running while someone waits for a sign-off. Duplicate stacks get built because teams can't get timely access to shared services. Temporary resources become permanent because nobody wants to reopen the change process to remove them. Then the executive conversation turns predictable. Why did our cloud bill go up? Why are teams still slow? Why are we paying for both the data center and Azure? And everyone points at the migration spreadsheet like it should answer questions about the operating model. It won't. So what's the fix when this pattern shows up? It is not optimize the Azure bill. That treats the symptom. The fix is redefine decision rights, then ship guardrails as products. Decision rights means the enterprise stops pretending that approvals create control. Approvals create delay. Control comes from enforcement in the platform. So the operating model shifts from ask permission to use the paved road. That requires a platform team that behaves like a product team, not a ticket desk. A platform team builds the reusable components that make the safe path the easiest path: standardized subscriptions, baseline policies, identity workflows, logging defaults, networking patterns, and deployment templates that are self-service. And when exceptions happen, and they will, the platform team doesn't negotiate them in hallways. It forces an explicit exception process with an owner, a reason, and an expiry. Because exceptions are entropy generators and entropy needs lifecycle management. This is where enterprises get the counterintuitive part wrong. They believe removing approvals reduces control. It increases control because now behavior is constrained by design rather than memory. Once that shift happens, you see the real speed up. Teams stop asking for permission to do normal work. They stop reinventing the same patterns. They ship faster because the platform encodes the organization's choices in advance, and the business stops paying for delay as a recurring subscription. So the lesson that lands with CIOs is blunt. Cloud didn't slow them. Their operating model did. Cloud didn't slow them, their operating model did. If you lift and shift into Azure and keep the same approval culture, you didn't migrate to cloud. You rented a new data center with a better API and a worse invoice. Story 2, the governance backlash. Freedom that becomes emergency control. The second pattern looks like the opposite of the first. Same failure, different costume. The vision usually starts as a reaction to bureaucracy. Developers need freedom. Don't block innovation. We're moving to Azure so teams can move fast. And on day one, it sounds sane because everyone is tired of tickets and committees. So leadership makes the classic move. They declare guardrails later. No policies yet because policies feel like friction. No identity governance yet because onboarding has to be fast. No cost model yet because chargeback is political. No landing zone standards yet because teams want autonomy. And the weird part is, for a few weeks, it works. Teams spin up resources, proofs of concept appear. Somebody demos something shiny. The cloud program looks like momentum. Everyone congratulates themselves for finally getting out of its way. Then reality shows up. Quietly at first. One team opens something to the internet because it was faster than private networking. Another team provisions oversized infrastructure because they don't know what right-sizing means yet, and nobody is paying the bill directly. A third team copies a Terraform snippet from the internet and ships a pattern that doesn't match enterprise security assumptions because enterprise security assumptions were never encoded anywhere. And now you have an enterprise that didn't remove friction. It outsourced friction into the future. Incidents start happening, costs spike, security teams start escalating, finance starts asking why spend is unpredictable. And this is where the backlash begins, because governance that's deferred doesn't disappear. It returns as emergency governance, always harsher. Emergency governance looks like this: blanket restrictions, frozen deployments, sudden approval gates, temporary central controls, and a security team that starts saying no by default because it no longer trusts what it can't see. So the enterprise swings from freedom to lockdown like it's inevitable. And it is inevitable because the system can't tolerate undefined boundaries at scale. This is the counterintuitive insight CIOs need to remember. And it is not optional. Governance does not slow enterprises down. Ambiguity does. Governance does not slow enterprises down. Ambiguity does. That distinction matters because most leaders think they're choosing between speed and control. They're not. They're choosing between clear constraints now or chaotic constraints later under pressure with worse politics. Ambiguity creates decision fatigue. Every team has to negotiate every boundary from scratch. Security reviews become bespoke. Architecture reviews become subjective. Finance becomes reactive. And every one of those negotiations adds latency. Not once, forever. Everything clicked for a lot of executives when they saw the second-order effect. The no guardrails phase creates so many inconsistent patterns that the only way to regain confidence is to centralize. And centralization becomes the emergency response, not the deliberate design. So what's the fix? It's not more governance meetings. That just adds paperwork on top of ambiguity. The fix is to embed governance where the platform actually makes decisions: policy, identity, and subscription structure early, before every workload becomes a special case. This is where the opening open loop pays off. Governance can increase speed when it removes ambiguity instead of adding paperwork. Because when the guardrails are explicit, teams stop asking permission. They know the boundaries. They can design inside them. And the platform enforces the boring parts consistently so humans don't have to. The enterprise also needs one uncomfortable operational rule. Exceptions have to be treated like radioactive material. Not forbidden, controlled. An exception needs an owner, a reason, and an expiry date. Otherwise, it isn't an exception. It's a permanent bypass that everyone will eventually rely on. Entropy packaged as flexibility. And this is the part leaders miss. Freedom without guardrails does not scale. It doesn't even stay free. It just postpones the cost until the first incident forces the enterprise to pay it all at once with interest. So the lesson from this pattern is simple. If you don't design governance early, you will get governance later. Only it will arrive as emergency control. And emergency control is the slowest, most political version of governance you can possibly build. Identity is the control plane, the foundational misunderstanding. After the governance backlash, most enterprises do the predictable thing. They try to fix governance by talking about networks. More segmentation, more firewalls, more diagrams with thick lines and thinner lines. And that's fine, as long as you understand what it is. It's comfort, because the foundational misunderstanding is that cloud control is network first. It isn't. In Azure and the Microsoft ecosystem, identity is the control plane. Entra is not just where users sign in. It is a distributed decision engine that sits behind Azure, Microsoft 365, and a long list of integrated services, making authorization decisions constantly, at machine speed, and at enterprise scale. That distinction matters because on-prem security taught everyone to think in terms of inside the network equals trusted. Cloud doesn't behave that way. Cloud assumes the network is compromised, the devices are inconsistent, and the workloads are moving targets. So the system pivots to identity, who is asking what they're asking for, from where, on what device, with what risk signals, and with what audit trail. If you treat identity as a directory you can clean up later, you're not postponing work, you're postponing control. And the system will fill that vacuum with exactly what we already talked about: exceptions, politics, and drift. Okay, so basically the enterprise trust fabric is not a firewall rule set. It's the identity and access model that defines who can do what, under what conditions, and how that access is reviewed over time. Identity is the rule book the cloud reads every time someone acts. Say that slowly because this is where executives usually lose the plot. Identity is the rule book the cloud reads every time someone acts. And here's the weird part. In cloud, someone doesn't just mean humans. Non-human identities are the fastest growing risk multiplier in the enterprise. Service principals, managed identities, workload identities, automation accounts, CI/CD pipelines. These are the things that actually run your cloud at 2 a.m. without approval meetings, with permissions that often outlive the project that created them. So if your governance model is, we reviewed access for our admins, congratulations, you've governed the least scalable part of the system. The real question is, who owns the lifecycle of non-human identities, and how do you prove they're still required, still scoped correctly, and still bound to the workload you think they're bound to? Because Azure doesn't care that a service principal was created during a sprint 3 quarters ago. It will continue to authorize it until you remove it. And if it has broad privileges, it will continue to enable broad actions, whether the current team understands it or not. This is why network-first thinking fails in cloud. Networks can reduce exposure, they can limit paths, they can block obvious mistakes, but networks don't answer the core control question. Is this action authorized for this identity under these conditions? Identity does. Conditional access is a good example of the marketing to reality gap. It gets positioned as a clean security feature. In architectural terms, it's part of the authorization compiler. It evaluates signals and emits a decision. Allow, block, require MFA, require compliant device, require phishing-resistant authentication, and so on. But when identity is designed late, conditional access becomes conditional chaos. Because now it's not expressing intent, it's patching holes. One app needs an exception, one executive needs bypass during travel, one old protocol breaks modern authentication. So the policy set grows into a web of if statements that nobody wants to touch. And remember the rule from earlier, every just this once turns deterministic control into probabilistic control. So when enterprises delay identity design, they don't get flexibility. They get an authorization graph that nobody fully understands. This is the uncomfortable truth. Identity is not a component you bolt onto your landing zone. Identity is the first landing zone. If you build subscriptions, networks, and workload platforms before you define identity boundaries, you've built the city before you wrote the laws. Then you act surprised when enforcement becomes political and audits become theater. So what does identity first mean at the executive level? Without turning this into an implementation tutorial, it means you decide upfront the shape of trust. What is privileged and what is not? How privileged access is requested, approved, and time-bound. How break glass access exists and how it's monitored. How non-human identities are created, rotated, reviewed, and retired. And who owns those workflows when the project team is gone? Because if nobody owns identity over time, identity ownership defaults to the loudest team and the least risky short-term choice, which means privileges drift upward. They always do. And once identity drifts, every other governance control becomes less meaningful. Policies get bypassed by owners, cost controls get overridden, and incident response becomes slower because nobody can tell which identity did what and why. So when you hear identity is the control plane, don't hear implement more MFA. Hear the real claim: Azure strategy fails when trust is designed late because the platform will keep executing whatever access you left behind. Story 3. The identity blind spot. Infrastructure ships ahead of trust. This third pattern is the quiet one. It doesn't show up as a disaster on day one. It shows up later in audit findings, privilege creep, and the kind of incidents where nobody can explain how an action was allowed in the first place. The vision sounds reasonable. We'll build the Azure foundation first, landing zones, subscriptions, network connectivity, maybe some shared services. Then we'll sort identity and governance once we're actually running workloads. It feels efficient, it feels practical, it feels like sequencing. It isn't. Because what actually happens is that infrastructure ships ahead of trust. Subscriptions get created under pressure. Teams need to move. Projects need environments. Someone needs owner to get things done. Service principals get created so pipelines can deploy. Managed identities get attached to resources because that's the easiest way to make the errors go away. And none of this is malicious. That's the point. Nothing was wrong, it was just too late. By the time leadership realizes identity is the control plane already contains history. Permissions granted during a crisis, exceptions made to hit a date, accounts created by teams that no longer exist, and policies that were written as patches, not as intent. So the identity layer becomes an archaeological dig. And enterprises are not good at archaeology because archaeology doesn't ship features. Here's what it looks like in a real organization. A platform team builds the landing zones. They connect on-prem, they stand up hubs, they establish management groups, everything looks correct on a diagram. Then the first wave of workloads comes in, and every workload has a different access story. Different admins, different vendors, different automation, different break glass demands. So the organization does what it always does under ambiguity. It grants broad access and promises to tighten later. Later never arrives, because tighten later is not a plan. It's a future incident response activity. Then conditional access starts getting configured as a reaction engine. One policy for admins, another policy for developers, another policy for contractors, another exclusion list because something legacy breaks, another exclusion list because the CEO is traveling, another exclusion list because a critical automation account can't handle MFA, another policy because an auditor asked a question. And over time, the organization builds a policy set that nobody trusts enough to change. So the identity control plane becomes brittle. It works until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, the business experiences it as cloud is unreliable, even though the actual problem is that trust was bolted on after the fact. The other failure mode is more dangerous, privilege drift. Teams keep owner because removing it risks breaking something. Service principals keep broad rights because nobody owns their life cycle. Emergency access stays enabled because the incident is over, but the change request to remove it is still open. The organization starts relying on the bypasses because the bypasses are the only deterministic part of the system. Then audits happen, and the audit becomes theater. You can show the landing zone diagram, you can show the list of policies, you can show that MFA exists somewhere, but you can't show intent enforced over time, who still needs access, why they have it, and what happens when they leave. So what fixes this pattern without turning it into a 6-month identity re-architecture project? The fix is identity first design executed as a constraint system, not a cleanup effort. Start with boundaries. What constitutes privileged access and what does not? Then workflows. How privileged access is requested, time-bound, and reviewed. Not once a year, continuously. Then non-human identity ownership, who creates service principals, who approves their permissions, how secrets rotate, how credentials expire, and how you prove the identity is still bound to a real workload with a real owner. Then exception lifecycle. Every bypass has an expiry and a named owner. No owner means no exception, because entropy without ownership is just drift. This is the part executives need to hear clearly. Identity work done early feels slow. Identity work done late is impossible. And when identity is impossible, everything else becomes cosmetic. Governance becomes paperwork, security becomes a negotiation, and speed becomes accidental. The lesson is blunt. You don't build trust after you build the platform. You build the platform inside a trust model you're willing to defend long after the project team is gone. FinOps as behavioral design, cost transparency as governance. After identity, the next illusion enterprises cling to is that cost is a procurement problem. It isn't. Azure pricing is just the meter. The real system is human behavior, who can create spend, who feels it, and who gets rewarded for ignoring it. So basically, FinOps isn't a toolset. It's behavioral design for a variable cost platform. It's governance, expressed as financial accountability. And here's the rule that decides whether it works. Who pays it, so who decides? If the people who make technical decisions never feel the bill, they will optimize for local throughput and call it delivery. If finance sees the bill but can't link it to a workload and an owner, finance will respond with blunt controls, freezes, quotas, and escalations. That's not because finance is irrational. It's because ambiguity is expensive and the business eventually demands someone stop the bleeding. Cloud doesn't hide costs, it reveals who owns them. Say it again, because it's the same pattern as identity, just in a different language. Cloud doesn't hide costs, it reveals who owns them. On-prem hid costs through amortization and shared infrastructure. A server sat in a rack, depreciation ticked along, and no product owner had to look at a daily invoice that changed based on behavior. Cloud removes that comfort. It makes cost observable near real-time and attributable if you do the work to make it attributable. And this is where most enterprises fail. They treat cost visibility as reporting, not as ownership. They build dashboards. They hold monthly meetings. They send angry emails about tagging compliance. None of that changes behavior if nobody has decision rights attached to the money. Dashboards don't create accountability. Incentives do. Why this matters is simple. Cost overruns don't just waste money, they trigger governance backlash. The moment spend becomes unpredictable, leadership doesn't ask for better charts. Leadership asks for control. And if the enterprise doesn't have a mature cost ownership model, the control arrives as emergency centralization. Again, same movie. What FinOps actually means at enterprise scale is 3 things. First, every workload has an owner who can explain its spend in plain language, not the cloud team. not IT, an accountable owner tied to a business outcome. Second, the organization decides the model, showback, chargeback, or some hybrid, but it commits to making the bill visible to the people with autonomy. If autonomy and accountability don't travel together, autonomy becomes entropy. Third, optimization becomes routine, not theater. Not a quarterly cost reduction initiative where someone right-sizes a few VMs and declares victory. Routine, reviews, anomaly detection, and deliberate trade-offs between cost, reliability, and speed. How does this work without turning the organization into a finance bureaucracy? By making the safe behavior the default, a platform team can pre-wire cost controls into the same paved road concept as identity and policy. Standard tagging, subscription structure aligned to cost centers, budgets and alerts, and guardrails that prevent predictable waste. Because the predictable waste is always the same. Over-provisioning, choosing sizes based on fear, not data. Idle resources, dev and test, that never shut down because nobody owns the cleanup. Zombie environments, projects that ended, but the resources stayed alive because decommissioning has no reward and too much process. And the quiet killer, duplicated shared services created because teams can't access a standard path fast enough. FinOps is how an enterprise admits those are not mistakes. They are the natural output of a system with unclear ownership. So a mature FinOps practice doesn't start with cost optimization. It starts with decision design. Who is allowed to spend, how spend is attributed, and how the organization responds before it panics. This is where the control plane connection matters. Identity decides who can act. Policy decides what they can deploy. FinOps decides who feels the consequence. And when those three are aligned, you get the outcome executives actually want: controlled autonomy. Teams can move fast because the boundaries are known and the cost is owned. Finance stops playing detectives. Security stops using cost overruns as proof the cloud is out of control. And leadership stops treating Azure spend as a mysterious force of nature. The enterprise just sees the truth. Variable cost platforms require variable accountability, and if you don't build it deliberately, you will still get accountability. Only it will show up as blame, budget cuts, and emergency governance. Story 4. The FinOps Awakening. When accountability matches autonomy. This pattern usually starts with a promise nobody should ever make out loud. Cloud will reduce costs. Not cloud can reduce certain costs if we change behaviors. Not cloud can make costs more visible than just reduce costs. So the first 6 months look like a victory lap. The data center is shrinking. A few apps moved. Finance sees some savings on hardware refresh delays. Leadership starts telling itself a story. We're being modern, and modern means cheaper. Then the bill arrives with enough line items to qualify as a psychological assessment, and the enterprise reacts in the most predictable way possible. It assumes the problem is pricing. It assumes the cloud provider is expensive. It assumes the engineers picked the wrong SKUs. It assumes there's a secret discount they forgot to negotiate. That's the comfortable narrative. It's also wrong. Because what actually happened was simpler. The organization kept a central IT funding model while handing out distributed autonomy. Engineering could create spend, product teams could spin up environments, projects could run parallel, but the cost landed in one place, owned by nobody who could influence it day to day. So cost became political. Finance saw a number it couldn't map to business value. IT saw pressure it couldn't translate into engineering decisions. Engineering saw angry questions without context and defaulted to the only defense engineers have. We need it. It's for delivery. The result is optimization theater. Dashboards show spend, people hold meetings, everyone agrees waste exists. Nothing changes because the incentives don't change. Then the fight starts. Finance wants budgets, caps, approvals, and sometimes blunt restrictions. Engineering wants freedom, speed, and a promise not to be punished for building. Central IT wants to keep everyone happy and ends up absorbing the pain. And while they argue, cloud spend becomes the new version of the old problem. Nobody owns the consequence of the decisions being made. This is the moment the pattern teaches the enterprise the real lesson. Cost is not a number. Cost is a decision trail. So the organizations that recover do one thing that feels almost boring, but it changes everything. They align accountability with autonomy. They stop funding cloud like a shared utility, and they start funding it like a product portfolio. They don't necessarily go straight to chargeback. Most won't and many shouldn't initially, but they do implement showback that's real. Every workload, every environment, every subscription has an owner with a cost center and a business narrative. Not cloud platform, not infrastructure, a named owner who can explain spend in business terms. And then they do the second thing, they build a review cadence that isn't punishment. A predictable rhythm where finance and engineering look at the same data with the same context and treat it as an engineering design problem, not a moral failure. Because the moment cost becomes moral, teams hide. And hidden cost is the most expensive kind. So the review becomes about decisions: what's running, why it's running, what can be scheduled off, what should be right-sized, what should be reserved because it's steady state. and what should be killed because it has no owner and no purpose. This is where accountability starts changing behavior more than tooling ever did. Teams with visibility start caring about tagging because tagging becomes how they defend their own budget. Teams start shutting down dev environments because the cost is now visible to the person who wants more headcount. Platform teams start offering cheap by default patterns, ephemeral environments, standard sizes, standard observability, because the platform is now measured on spend predictability, not on how many resources it can provision. And finance, interestingly, becomes less controlling, not more. Because when finance can see ownership and trend lines, it stops needing emergency controls. It stops needing to freeze it. It stops needing to cap everything. It can govern with confidence instead of fear. So the outcome isn't we optimized Azure. The outcome is that the enterprise finally made the hidden operating model explicit. Who is allowed to spend, who benefits from spend, and who must explain spend. That's the FinOps awakening. Cloud doesn't magically reduce costs. It forces the organization to confront who owns decisions. And once accountability matches autonomy, the bill stops being a ransom note and becomes a feedback loop you can actually use. Operating model, platform teams, product teams, and decision rights. Once identity, policy, and cost accountability start behaving like real constraints, the next question is unavoidable. How do teams actually operate safely at scale without turning cloud into a ticket queue again? That's the operating model. And most enterprises get it backwards. They buy tools, publish reference architectures, hire a few cloud engineers, and then wonder why delivery still feels like molasses. Because they never redesigned the flow of decisions. Traditional IT operating models assume scarcity and central control. Cloud assumes abundance and distributed execution. If you keep the old model, you don't get governed cloud. You get conditional chaos with a service catalog. Here's what most people miss. An operating model isn't org charts. It's a decision system. Who can do what? Under which constraints, with what accountability, and with what enforcement. That distinction matters because cloud transformation fails in enterprises that treat operating model as a workshop output instead of a control plane design. So at enterprise scale, the only model that survives is the one that separates responsibilities cleanly. Platform teams build the paved roads, product teams drive on them, and leadership makes decision rights explicit instead of letting them drift. Platform teams are not gatekeepers, they're control plane builders. Their job is to turn enterprise intent into reusable self-service paths, subscription vending, baseline security and logging, network patterns, identity workflows, policy assignments, cost allocation structure, and safe deployment patterns. They ship those as products with roadmaps, versioning, and support boundaries. Not email us and we'll create a resource group. And products with interfaces. If a platform team becomes a ticket desk, the enterprise has simply rebuilt its data center bureaucracy in Azure, now with more YAML. Product teams, on the other hand, own business outcomes. They should have autonomy inside guardrails, choices about application architecture, feature delivery, deployment cadence, and how they consume platform capabilities. They should also own the lifecycle of what they deploy, reliability, security posture within the boundaries, and cost of their workloads. Autonomy without lifecycle ownership is just risk outsourcing. Now, the tension is obvious. Platform teams want consistency. Product teams want speed. Security wants assurance. Finance wants predictability. Nobody gets everything. That's the point. The operating model exists to make the trade-offs explicit so teams stop negotiating the same arguments on every workload. This is where the decision rights matrix stops being a nice artifact and becomes the enterprise's reality check. And here's the warning soundbite that determines whether this works. If decision rights aren't explicit, they default to politics. If decision rights aren't explicit, they default to politics. Politics scales better than process. It's also less auditable and more expensive. So what belongs in a decision rights matrix at the executive level? Not 100 rocky rows. The few decisions that generate the most entropy. Architecture standards, what's mandatory versus optional. Security posture, what's enforced through policy and identity, and what requires exception. Cost and funding, who owns spend, who approves steady state commitments, who is accountable for waste. Exceptions, who can grant them, how long they live, and how they get reviewed. Lifecycle ownership, who is responsible when a workload is abandoned, when a team reorganizes, when vendors leave, when automation breaks. When those decision rights are vague, you get drift. Teams build unique patterns because it's faster locally. Security starts adding reviews because it can't trust the baseline. Finance escalates because it can't map spend to value. Operations becomes the shock absorber, and the cloud program becomes a political arena. When those decision rights are explicit, the behavior changes. Platform teams stop being the department of no and become the department of paved roads. Product teams stop waiting for approvals and start shipping inside known constraints. Security stops negotiating control case by case and starts validating that the enforcement mechanisms are in place. Finance stops blaming engineering and starts governing through ownership. And notice what changed, not Azure, the decision system. So the practical design goal for CIOs is simple: maximize throughput by reducing negotiation load. A mature operating model doesn't remove governance, it removes bespoke governance. It replaces one-off reviews with default paths. It makes the standard path boring, fast, and safe. Then it treats everything else as an exception with lifecycle. Because exceptions are not proof your strategy is flexible. They are proof your strategy is incomplete. And in cloud, incomplete strategies don't stay incomplete. They accumulate. Landing zones as management philosophy, not infrastructure cosplay. Now take that operating model idea, paved roads, explicit decision rights, and make it tangible. In Azure, the thing that turns we have a strategy into we behave differently is usually called a landing zone. And most enterprises misunderstand what that is. They treat landing zones like a reference deployment, a bundle of networking, a few subscriptions, some policy assignments, a diagram that gets printed and forgotten. That's infrastructure cosplay. A real landing zone is not a template. It is a management philosophy encoded into the control plane. Because a landing zone answers the questions executives keep dodging. How much autonomy do we allow? How much control do we enforce? And where do we accept exceptions? That distinction matters because if you don't answer those questions once, explicitly, you will answer them 1,000 times implicitly through politics and drift. The enterprise scale mechanics are simple. Management groups define inheritance. Subscriptions define blast radius and accountability. Policies and role assignments define what is allowed, what is denied, and what gets auto-remediated. Logging and monitoring define what the enterprise can actually see. Network topology defines where you allow connectivity and where you force isolation. But the important point is not the components. The important point is the intent they enforce. A landing zone is where the enterprise stops pretending that guidance is governance. Guidance is optional. Landing zones make it enforced. That's why the management group structure matters so much. Not because hierarchy feels orderly, but because inheritance is how you scale intent. If the only place governance exists is inside a wiki, then every new subscription becomes a negotiation. If governance exists at the management group level, then every subscription starts with a baseline, and teams spend their time building workloads instead of building defenses. Subscriptions get misunderstood too. Enterprises love to map subscriptions to org charts because org charts are familiar, but subscriptions are not an HR construct. They are a containment boundary for cost allocation, for policy scope, for access scope, and for incident blast radius. When you design subscription boundaries poorly, you get two predictable outcomes. Either everything piles into one subscription because central IT wants control, and then every team blocks every other team and you recreate the ticket desk. Or you create subscriptions per team with no baseline, and then every team invents a new world and you recreate the governance backlash. Landing zones exist to avoid both failure modes. They provide standardized paths, subscription vending that comes with tags, RBAC defaults, diagnostics, policy assignments, and connectivity patterns already in place. So the act of creating an environment becomes a governed decision, not a heroic one. And then there's policy. Most enterprises treat Azure policy like an audit checkbox. We have policies. That is not the point. The point is enforcement and drift control. Audit-only policies tell you what you already know. Humans do inconsistent things under time pressure. Deny policies prevent classes of mistakes you never want to see in production. Modify policies fix predictable omissions like tagging. Deploy if not exist patterns can push required configurations like diagnostics and backups without waiting for someone to remember. In other words, policy is where intent becomes non-negotiable. And that's also where exceptions reveal what your strategy refuses to decide. Every enterprise has exceptions. The question is whether exceptions are managed or whether exceptions become the architecture. A mature landing zone treats exceptions as controlled entropy generators. Documented, time-bound, owned, and periodically reviewed. If the exception doesn't expire, it is not an exception. It is a new standard that nobody admitted to. This is why landing zones aren't a project deliverable. They're a living product. They need versioning. They need change control. They need an owner. And they need an operating cadence because the enterprise doesn't stand still. Acquisitions happen, regulations change, identity models evolve, and new services show up that bypass old assumptions. So when leaders ask, do we have landing zones? The correct question is harsher. Do we have enforced default paths that encode our decision rights, and do we manage drift over time? If the answer is no, then you don't have landing zones. You have scaffolding. And here's the tieback that should be explicit because it's the through line of the whole episode. Every story you've heard today breaks without this baseline. Lift and shift becomes expensive hosting because there's no paved road and no enforcement. Freedom becomes emergency governance because there are no default constraints. Identity becomes conditional chaos because access boundaries weren't built into the environment design. FinOps becomes political because cost allocation wasn't baked into the subscription model. So landing zones are where the enterprise stops talking and starts committing, not to Azure, to its own decisions. What mature Azure strategy looks like. Patterns that survive scale. At this point, Mature can't mean finished because cloud doesn't end. The platform changes, the business reorganizes, regulations mutate, people leave, new teams arrive with new shortcuts. So maturity is not perfection. Maturity is stable tension. It's the organization maintaining a balance between speed and control without collapsing into bureaucracy or chaos. And in Azure, that balance shows up as a few patterns that survive scale, even when everything else drifts. First, workload placement is explicit, not cloud first, not hybrid forever, not everything on Azure unless someone complains. An explicit workload placement policy says, these workloads stay where they are, these workloads move as is, these workloads modernize before they move, and these workloads get retired. It names the reasons: data residency, latency, dependency density, licensing realities, or risk appetite. That policy doesn't eliminate debates, it eliminates repetitive debates, because without it, every workload becomes a negotiation and the loudest stakeholder wins. That's not strategy, that's entropy with a project plan. Second, identity first stays true even after the migration wave. Most enterprises do an identity push during the cloud program, then they treat it like a milestone, then privileges drift again. Mature environments don't let identity drift become normal. Privileged access stays time-bound, reviews are continuous, non-human identities have life-cycle ownership, with rotation and retirement treated like operational hygiene, not best effort. And the point is not more security. The point is a deterministic trust model. If the enterprise can't explain who can do what and why, then it is not running a governed platform, it is running a distributed permission experiment. Third, governance is enforced by design, not defended by policy documents. Policies don't matter when they're optional. Blueprints don't matter when no one uses them. Landing zones don't matter when teams bypass them and call it speed. Mature Azure strategy means the default paths are real and easy. Subscription vending, baseline policies, logging, networking patterns, and deployment templates. Teams choose within those paths, and the unsafe path is deliberately harder. That's not punishment, that's alignment. And it's the only model that scales because it eliminates negotiation load. It prevents the enterprise from spending its time relitigating the same risk decisions on every workload. Fourth, cost visibility is aligned to the business, not just to the tenant. You can't have cost predictability without incentives that match spend. Mature Azure strategy makes that explicit. Business units see their spend, understand their unit economics, and have a routine cadence to make trade-offs. That doesn't mean everything becomes chargeback tomorrow. It means someone owns the bill and can explain it, is enforced as a normal expectation. FinOps becomes part of how teams operate, not an audit ritual that shows up when finance is angry. Fifth, Azure is treated as a strategic platform, not a project. The enterprise doesn't stop at rehost and declare victory. It builds a modernization roadmap that moves the right workloads into managed services, reduces operational toil, and shrinks the inventory of Snowflake infrastructure that requires heroics to maintain. And this is the part that makes executives uncomfortable. Modernization isn't a single budget request, it's a multi-year discipline. But the alternative isn't save money. The alternative is to keep paying for yesterday's architecture inside tomorrow's platforms. So what does maturity look like? In conversation, not in diagrams. It sounds like executives can answer 5 questions without going silent. What goes where and why? Who can decide and who can override? What is enforced by the platform and what is merely guidance? Who pays and who benefits? What happens when someone asks for an exception? If those questions have clear, repeatable answers, the system stays stable even as teams change. That's what scale requires, because the cloud doesn't punish you for being imperfect. It punishes you for being ambiguous. And that brings the whole thing full circle to the core insight you already heard earlier, but that needs to land again at the end. Governance does not slow enterprises down. Ambiguity does. Mature Azure strategy is the enterprise deciding where it will tolerate ambiguity and then designing everything else so ambiguity can't hide. Closing. Executive takeaways that don't decay. Cloud strategy is enterprise strategy. Azure will execute the decisions you made, and it will also execute the decisions you avoided. Remember the triad. Adoption is exposure. Migration is movement. Strategy is choice. If you want one concrete move this quarter, pick one artifact, workload placement policy, or a decision rights matrix, and operationalize it so teams stop negotiating from scratch. If you want more episodes like this, subscribe and watch the next one on identity-first design and why conditional access becomes conditional chaos when intent isn't enforced.